Hello again, this is Dr. Reginald Yawnsworth, and tonight we're reluctantly examining humanity's sequel to the Great War, World War II, where civilization looked at the catastrophic lessons of 1914 to 1918 and said, you know what, we didn't kill nearly enough people last time. Let's try this again with better technology and even worse ideas. A story of magnificent technological achievement applied to systematic genocide, ideological madness that made nationalism look reasonable, and the stunning human capacity to turn every scientific advancement into a more efficient method of extermination. So settle in, perhaps check your air raid shelter if you have one, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Are you in Poland, where the concept of existing as a nation was temporarily cancelled by administrative decree? Or perhaps in Hiroshima, where physics students got a rather dramatic demonstration of E equals mc squared. Wherever you are, turn off those modern conveniences and let's stumble back to 1939 to witness humanity's second attempt at industrialized global warfare, now with 300% more war crimes and featuring exciting new methods of mass murder. Tonight's story isn't just about war, though there's certainly an abundance of that. It's about how a civilization could perfect the art of propaganda so thoroughly that entire nations enthusiastically participated in their own destruction. It's about leaders who treated genocide like an administrative problem, scientists who applied their expertise to building better death machines, and the fascinating human ability to transform every technological breakthrough into a more creative way to eliminate each other. This is the story of the Second World War. More devastating, more global, and more morally bankrupt than anything that came before, marked by the industrialization of genocide, the militarization of science, and the rise of warfare as humanity's preferred method of urban renewal. It's about the moment when our ancestors decided that the Great War hadn't been quite great enough and that maybe, just maybe, a really comprehensive global conflict would finally solve all their ideological differences. Chapter 1. The Sequel Nobody Asked For, 1939. Welcome to 1939, when Europe had spent 20 years recovering from the last catastrophic war and was about to discover that the peace settlement had created conditions perfect for an even more catastrophic sequel. Congratulations, you've just woken up in a world where the lessons of the Great War were carefully studied and completely ignored. The Treaty of Versailles had been designed to prevent German recovery, but it actually created conditions that made extremist movements inevitable. Germany was simultaneously too weak to defend itself and too strong to remain permanently suppressed, while economic depression provided perfect conditions for political movements that promised simple solutions to complex problems. Adolf Hitler had spent the 1920s developing a comprehensive ideology based on racial superiority, territorial expansion, and the application of industrial methods to systematic murder. What made Hitler dangerous wasn't his originality. Racism and nationalism were common in 1930s Europe, but his willingness to pursue these ideas to their logical conclusion regardless of consequences. The Nazi rise to power demonstrated that democratic institutions could be destroyed from within by movements that used democratic processes to gain power and then eliminated democracy once they controlled the government. The Weimar Republic collapsed not through foreign invasion but through internal subversion by people who understood that constitutional protections only work when everyone agrees to respect them. By 1939, Germany had violated every provision of the Versailles Treaty, while European leaders congratulated themselves on maintaining peace through diplomatic negotiations with people who viewed diplomacy as weakness. The policy of appeasement was based on the reasonable assumption that Germany wanted to revise the peace settlement, not destroy European civilization. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, demonstrated that Hitler's goals went far beyond revising Versailles to include the complete reconstruction of European society according to Nazi racial theories. Poland wasn't just defeated militarily but was systematically destroyed as a political entity, while its population was subjected to policies designed to eliminate Polish culture and identity. Britain and France declared war on Germany to honor their guarantee of Polish independence, but they had no ability to actually help Poland and no plan for fighting Germany beyond hoping that economic pressure would force German surrender. The phony war of 1939 to 1940 demonstrated that declaring war was easier than actually fighting one. The Soviet invasion of Poland from the east revealed that Stalin had concluded a non-aggression pact with Hitler that included secret provisions for dividing Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact demonstrated that ideological enemies could cooperate when they shared territorial ambitions. Poland was destroyed within weeks by German and Soviet forces using combined arms tactics that demonstrated how military technology had advanced since 1918. Tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry working together could achieve the decisive victories that had been impossible on the Western Front, but only when attacking enemies who lacked modern equipment and adequate preparation. The conquest of Poland provided Germany with resources, territory, and a laboratory for testing policies that would later be applied throughout occupied Europe. Polish intellectuals, clergy, and political leaders were systematically murdered to eliminate potential resistance, while Polish children were kidnapped for Germanization, and Polish workers were enslaved for German industrial production. Chapter 2. Blitzkrieg and the Fall of France, 1940. The German offensive in Western Europe demonstrated that the military lessons of World War I had been learned, but only by one side. While Britain and France prepared for another war of attrition based on defensive positions and economic blockade, Germany developed tactics based on speed, concentration of force, and the psychological impact of rapid advances. The conquest of Denmark and Norway in April 1940 revealed German strategic thinking that prioritized securing resources and naval bases over respecting neutral rights. Denmark surrendered without resistance, while Norway was conquered despite British naval superiority and Allied expeditionary forces. The campaigns demonstrated that German military planning was superior to Allied responses. The Battle of France began with German attacks through the Ardennes that bypassed the Maginot Line and concentrated forces at the weakest point in Allied defences. French military doctrine was based on World War I experience and assumed that the main German attack would come through Belgium, allowing German forces to achieve complete tactical surprise. Blitzkrieg tactics combined tanks, aircraft, and infantry in coordinated attacks that moved faster than Allied forces could respond. German success wasn't based on superior numbers or equipment, but on superior tactics, communication, and command decisions that concentrated force at decisive points while maintaining momentum through rapid advances. The evacuation at Dunkirk saved the British expeditionary force from complete destruction, but left Britain without heavy equipment and demonstrated that German forces had achieved decisive victory in continental Europe within 6 weeks. The miracle of Dunkirk was actually a catastrophic military defeat disguised as moral victory through superior public relations. The fall of France shocked the world because France had been considered the strongest military power in Europe and had spent enormous resources on defensive fortifications that proved useless when the enemy refused to attack them directly. The Maginot Line was an engineering marvel that defended against the wrong war. Marshal Pétain's Vichy government collaborated with German occupation because French political leaders believed that resistance was futile and that cooperation would minimize suffering. The Vichy regime demonstrated how occupied populations could be induced to participate in their own subjugation through promises of reduced punishment for compliance. Charles de Gaulle's call for continued resistance from London was initially ignored by most French people who believed that the war was over and that accommodation with German victory was preferable to continued destruction. The Free French movement began with almost no popular support and grew only as German occupation policies became increasingly brutal. The Battle of Britain was Germany's attempt to gain air superiority as preparation for invading the British Isles. The campaign failed because German aircraft lacked the range to maintain sustained operations over Britain, while British radar provided early warning that allowed efficient use of limited fighter aircraft. Winston Churchill's leadership during the Battle of Britain demonstrated the importance of political will in modern warfare. Churchill understood that British survival required convincing the population that resistance was possible and that negotiated peace with Hitler would lead to eventual subjugation rather than honourable compromise. Chapter 3. The War Goes Global, 1941. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, transformed a European war into a global conflict and demonstrated that Hitler's ambitions included not just territorial conquest but the complete reconstruction of human society, according to Nazi racial ideology. Operation Barbarossa was simultaneously the largest military operation in history and a plan for systematic genocide. Hitler's decision to attack the Soviet Union while still fighting Britain violated basic principles of military strategy but reflected Nazi ideology that viewed the war as a racial struggle requiring the elimination of inferior populations rather than traditional military victory. The invasion was designed to destroy the Soviet state and exterminate the Slavic population. Initial German successes were spectacular as Soviet forces were surprised, poorly led, and equipped with obsolete tactics. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured in enormous encirclements, while German forces advanced hundreds of miles within weeks. The Soviet Union appeared to be collapsing just as France had done the previous year. Stalin's initial response to the invasion was paralysis and denial, leaving Soviet forces without effective leadership during the critical opening weeks. The purges of the 1930s had eliminated most experienced military commanders, while Soviet doctrine emphasized political reliability over military competence. The Red Army was not prepared for modern warfare. The siege of Leningrad began in September 1941 and lasted 872 days, demonstrating that modern warfare could include the deliberate starvation of civilian populations as military policy. The siege killed over 1 million civilians through starvation, disease, and artillery bombardment, but the city never surrendered despite conditions that made survival nearly impossible. The Battle of Moscow revealed that German forces were not prepared for winter warfare, and that Soviet resistance was stronger than Nazi racial ideology had predicted. German advances slowed as supply lines lengthened, equipment failed in sub-zero temperatures, and Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberian military districts. Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war through a Japanese attack that was tactically successful but strategically catastrophic. Japan destroyed much of the American Pacific Fleet but failed to eliminate American aircraft carriers and provided the United States with popular support for total war against the Axis powers. The Japanese attack was based on the assumption that Americans lacked the will to fight a prolonged war and would negotiate peace rather than suffer heavy casualties in Pacific operations. This assumption proved disastrously wrong as Pearl Harbor united American public opinion behind a war effort that would eventually produce military forces larger than all other combatants combined. Hitler's declaration of war against the United States eliminated any possibility that America would concentrate on fighting Japan while leaving Germany to complete the conquest of Europe. The declaration was militarily insane but ideologically consistent with Nazi beliefs about racial struggle and the necessity of fighting all enemies simultaneously. The formation of the Grand Alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States created a coalition that controlled superior resources and industrial capacity, but required cooperation between ideological enemies who disagreed about post-war goals. Alliance management became as important as military strategy. Chapter 4. The Holocaust and Genocide, 1941 to 1945. The systematic murder of European Jews, Roma, disabled individuals and other groups targeted by Nazi racial ideology represents the logical conclusion of applying industrial methods to genocide. The Holocaust wasn't an accidental byproduct of war, but a deliberate policy that consumed enormous resources and required the participation of thousands of people throughout German society. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 formalized plans for the final solution that would murder all European Jews through systematic deportation, to extermination camps equipped with gas chambers designed specifically for mass killing. The conference demonstrated that genocide was planned and coordinated at the highest levels of German government. Extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor were designed as factories for producing death through assembly line methods that maximized efficiency while minimizing psychological trauma for the perpetrators. The camps represented the application of modern industrial management techniques to systematic murder. The Einsatzgruppen conducted mass executions in occupied Eastern Europe that killed over 1 million Jews, Roma, and Soviet officials through shootings that required direct participation by ordinary German soldiers and police. These mass killings demonstrated that genocide required widespread participation rather than just specialized personnel. Medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners revealed that respected scientists and physicians could participate in torture and murder when these activities were presented as legitimate research. The medicalization of genocide showed how professional expertise could be corrupted by ideological commitments. The selection process at concentration camps divided arriving prisoners into those who would be immediately murdered and those who would be worked to death through slave labor. This process required guards, administrators, and technical personnel to make daily decisions about who would live and who would die. Resistance to the Holocaust was limited but significant, ranging from hidden weapons and escape attempts to uprisings at Sobibor and Treblinka that succeeded in destroying the camps and allowing some prisoners to escape. Resistance demonstrated that even under extreme conditions, some people refused to cooperate with their own extermination. Collaboration with genocide varied throughout occupied Europe, from enthusiastic participation in countries with strong anti-Semitic traditions to passive resistance in countries where local populations attempted to protect Jewish neighbors. The Holocaust required local cooperation but also revealed the limits of that cooperation. Allied governments received credible reports about systematic genocide by 1942, but took limited action beyond issuing statements condemning German policies. Military leaders argued that winning the war quickly was the best way to help Holocaust victims, while political leaders worried about domestic anti-Semitism and immigration restrictions. The liberation of concentration camps by Allied forces revealed the full scope of Nazi crimes and provided evidence for war crimes prosecutions. However, liberation came too late for most victims, and many survivors faced continued persecution in their home countries after the war ended. Chapter 5. Turning Points and Allied Victory, 1942 to 1943. The year 1942 marked the turning point when Axis expansion reached its maximum extent and Allied industrial production began to overwhelm Axis military capabilities. The war's outcome was determined not just by military victories, but by the ability to produce weapons, supply armies, and replace losses faster than the enemy. The Battle of Stalingrad demonstrated that German forces could be decisively defeated through Soviet tactics that emphasized urban warfare, encirclement, and the willingness to accept enormous casualties to achieve strategic objectives. The destruction of the German Sixth Army marked the beginning of continuous German retreat on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Midway showed that Japanese naval superiority in the Pacific could be eliminated through superior intelligence, tactical innovation, and effective use of aircraft carriers. The loss of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and their experienced pilots was irreplaceable and marked the beginning of American offensive operations in the Pacific. The North African campaign concluded with the surrender of all Axis forces in Tunisia, eliminating German and Italian influence in Africa, while providing Allied forces with experience in combined arms operations before invading Europe. The campaign also secured Middle Eastern oil supplies that were crucial for Allied military operations. The Battle of Kursk was Germany's last major offensive operation on the Eastern Front, and demonstrated that German armored superiority could be overcome through defensive tactics, superior numbers, and effective use of anti-tank weapons. The battle consumed German reserve forces that could never be replaced. Allied strategic bombing of Germany was designed to destroy industrial production and civilian morale, but achieved mixed results at enormous cost in aircraft and aircrew. The bombing campaign tied down German resources in air defense, but did not decisively affect German war production until the final months of the war. The U-boat war in the Atlantic was won by Allied technological advances including radar, sonar, improved escort tactics, and code breaking that allowed convoy routing to avoid German submarine concentrations. The defeat of the U-boat threat was essential for supplying Allied forces and maintaining transatlantic communication. Italian surrender in September 1943 eliminated Germany's most important ally, but did not end fighting in Italy, as German forces continued to resist Allied advances through terrain that favored defensive operations. The Italian campaign became a prolonged and costly struggle that continued until the war's end. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising demonstrated that even under hopeless conditions, some people would choose to fight rather than accept passive extermination. The uprising was crushed, but inspired resistance movements throughout occupied Europe and provided moral vindication for armed resistance to Nazi occupation. Soviet industrial production reached peak efficiency in 1943 as factories evacuated from Western Russia began full production, while American Lend-Lease provided essential supplies and equipment. Soviet forces received better weapons, improved training, and more effective leadership as the war continued. Chapter 6. The Beginning of the End, 1944. D-Day opened the second front in Western Europe that Stalin had demanded since 1941 and demonstrated Allied capability for conducting complex amphibious operations against fortified positions. The Normandy landings succeeded because of superior planning, overwhelming material superiority, and German strategic errors. Operation Overlord required unprecedented coordination between air, sea, and land forces from multiple nations while maintaining operational security that prevented German commanders from anticipating the timing and location of the invasion. The operation's success proved that Allied military cooperation had reached sophisticated levels. The breakout from Normandy demonstrated that Allied forces had learned to conduct mobile warfare using combined arms tactics that rivaled German capabilities. The rapid advance across France showed that Allied commanders could exploit tactical successes to achieve strategic objectives. The liberation of Paris provided symbolic victory that demonstrated Allied commitment to restoring democratic governments in occupied territories. However, liberation also revealed political tensions between Allied governments about post-war arrangements and the role of resistance movements in liberated countries. Operation Bagration destroyed German Army Group Center and eliminated German control over Belarus and eastern Poland through Soviet tactics that emphasized rapid advances, encirclement of enemy forces, and coordination between multiple army groups. The operation was the most successful Soviet offensive of the war. The Warsaw Uprising was launched by the Polish Home Army in anticipation of Soviet liberation, but was crushed by German forces while Soviet troops remained outside the city. The uprising's failure demonstrated Soviet unwillingness to support non-communist resistance movements and foreshadowed post-war conflicts. The Battle of the Philippine Sea eliminated remaining Japanese carrier aviation through American tactics that emphasized superior training, better aircraft, and overwhelming numerical superiority. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot ended Japanese ability to conduct offensive carrier operations. The Holocaust reached peak efficiency in 1944 as Hungarian Jews were deported and murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau at rates that exceeded the capacity of crematorium facilities. The final phase of genocide demonstrated that Nazi commitment to extermination continued even as military defeat became inevitable. V1 and V2 attacks on London showed that Germany could develop sophisticated weapons technology but lacked the resources to produce decisive results. The rocket attacks caused civilian casualties but had no military significance and diverted resources from more effective defensive preparations. The July 20th plot against Hitler revealed that some German military leaders recognized that the war was lost and that Nazi policies were destroying Germany. However, the conspiracy's failure demonstrated that Hitler retained control over German institutions and that organized resistance to Nazi rule was limited. Chapter 7. The Final Collapse, 1945. The year 1945 witnessed the complete collapse of the Axis powers through Allied offensives that demonstrated overwhelming superiority in men, materials, and strategic coordination. The end came not through negotiated settlement, but through unconditional surrender that eliminated Axis governments and occupied their territories. The Yalta Conference attempted to coordinate Allied post-war plans but revealed fundamental disagreements about the future of Eastern Europe, Germany, and the United Nations. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin managed to maintain alliance cooperation for the war's conclusion, but could not resolve underlying political tensions. The crossing of the Rhine eliminated Germany's last natural defensive barrier and allowed Allied forces to advance into the heart of Germany against minimal resistance. German military collapse was so complete that organized defense became impossible, and surrender was only a matter of time. The meeting of American and Soviet forces at the Elbe River symbolized Allied victory, but also marked the beginning of division between former allies as occupied Germany was partitioned into zones that reflected post-war spheres of influence rather than temporary military arrangements. The discovery of concentration camps by Allied forces provided conclusive evidence of Nazi genocide and demonstrated the moral necessity of total victory over regimes that practiced systematic extermination. Liberation came too late for most victims, but preserved evidence for historical memory and legal prosecutions. Hitler's suicide in the Berlin bunker eliminated Nazi leadership and allowed German military commanders to surrender without being accused of betraying their oath of loyalty. Hitler's death made German surrender possible, but did not eliminate Nazi influence or prevent the post-war survival of Nazi ideology. The Battle of Berlin was an urban warfare nightmare that demonstrated Soviet determination to capture the Nazi capital, regardless of casualties. The battle had no military significance but enormous symbolic importance as proof that Nazi Germany had been completely defeated. The Potsdam Conference addressed post-war arrangements but revealed that Allied cooperation was ending as the war concluded. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin could agree on occupying Germany and prosecuting war criminals, but disagreed about almost everything else. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated American possession of weapons that could destroy entire cities instantly and forced Japanese surrender without the need for invasion. The bombings also initiated the nuclear age and fundamentally changed international relations. Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, ended World War II but began new conflicts over the post-war international order. The surrender eliminated the last Axis power but created power vacuums throughout Asia that would lead to civil wars, independence movements, and Cold War confrontations. Chapter 8. The Aftermath and Reckoning. The war's end revealed destruction on a scale that exceeded even the pessimistic predictions of those who had experienced World War I. Entire cities had been destroyed, millions of people had been displaced from their homes, and political systems throughout Europe and Asia required complete reconstruction. The Nuremberg Trials established precedents for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity, while demonstrating that following orders was not a valid defense for participating in genocide. However, most war criminals escaped prosecution, and many Nazi officials found new careers in post-war governments. Displaced persons camps housed millions of refugees who could not or would not return to their pre-war homes due to political changes, ethnic cleansing, or fear of persecution. The refugee crisis continued for years after the war ended and created permanent demographic changes throughout Europe. The Marshall Plan provided American economic assistance for European reconstruction, but also established American influence over Western European economic policies. The plan was successful in rebuilding European economies, but also divided Europe into American and Soviet spheres of influence. The United Nations was created to prevent future wars through collective security and international cooperation, but the organization was paralyzed by great power rivalries that reflected post-war tensions between former allies. The UN succeeded in preventing world war, but could not prevent regional conflicts. The Bretton Woods system established American economic dominance through dollar-based international monetary arrangements that replaced British financial leadership. The new system facilitated post-war economic recovery but also created dependencies that persisted throughout the Cold War period. Decolonization accelerated after the war as European powers lacked the resources to maintain overseas empires, while indigenous nationalist movements gained strength from wartime experience and Allied rhetoric about democracy and self-determination. The war marked the beginning of the end of European imperialism. Scientific advances accelerated by wartime research included nuclear weapons, jet aircraft, radar, computers, and medical technologies that transformed post-war society. However, these advances also created new dangers and ethical dilemmas about the appropriate use of scientific knowledge. The Cold War began before World War II ended as former allies competed for influence over liberated territories and disagreed about post-war political arrangements. The alliance that had defeated the Axis powers became the foundation for new conflicts that dominated international relations for decades. Chapter 9. Lessons Learned and Ignored. World War II demonstrated that modern warfare could threaten the survival of human civilization through nuclear weapons, systematic genocide, and total mobilization of industrial societies for military purposes. The war's lessons about the dangers of ideological extremism and international cooperation were clear but not always heeded. The war proved that democratic institutions required active defense against movements that used democratic processes to gain power and then eliminated democracy. The collapse of the Weimar Republic and other democratic governments showed that constitutional protections were not self-enforcing. Technology's role in warfare was permanently transformed as scientific research became militarized and weapons development became a continuous process rather than a wartime emergency. The war demonstrated that technological superiority could provide decisive military advantages but also created new dangers. The importance of international cooperation was demonstrated by Allied victory, which required unprecedented coordination between nations with different political systems, strategic goals, and cultural traditions. However, post-war conflicts showed that international cooperation was difficult to maintain without external threats. Economic mobilization for total war showed that modern states could direct entire economies toward military purposes, but also revealed the costs of such mobilization in terms of civilian welfare, democratic governance, and post-war recovery. The war economy became a model for post-war government intervention. The Holocaust demonstrated that genocide was possible in modern industrial societies and required widespread participation by ordinary people who convinced themselves that mass murder was necessary, legal, or morally justified. The lesson about the fragility of civilized behavior was clear but disturbing. Resistance movements showed that even under extreme oppression, some people would choose to fight rather than collaborate with evil regimes. However, resistance also revealed the costs of confronting authoritarian governments and the limitations of moral courage without adequate material support. The war's global scope demonstrated that local conflicts could escalate into worldwide catastrophes and that no nation could remain isolated from international crises. However, post-war conflicts showed that this lesson did not prevent regional wars or great power confrontations. Military strategy was revolutionized by combined arms tactics, strategic bombing, amphibious operations, and electronic warfare that made previous military doctrine obsolete. However, the war also showed that military victory required political objectives and that conquest without legitimacy was temporary. Chapter 10. The War That Changed Everything. So there you have it. World War II, where humanity discovered that the Great War had been merely a preliminary exercise and that with proper application, industrial civilization could produce destruction that made previous catastrophes look like minor inconveniences. This was supposed to be the war that would eliminate fascism and make the world safe for democracy, but it turned out that eliminating fascism required destroying most of Europe and Asia first. The Second World War represents humanity's most comprehensive experiment in total warfare, where entire societies were mobilized for military purposes and the distinction between combatants and civilians was deliberately eliminated. The result was a conflict that consumed resources on an unprecedented scale while producing political results that satisfied some people and created new problems that persist today. What's remarkable about World War II is not that it happened. The Great War had created conditions that made another major conflict probable. What's remarkable is that rational, educated leaders could convince themselves that racial superiority was scientifically valid, that genocide was administratively efficient, and that global conquest was practically achievable. The war demonstrated that technological progress without moral progress leads to increasingly sophisticated methods of destruction rather than human improvement. Every scientific advancement, from radar to rockets to nuclear fission, was immediately weaponized and used to kill people more efficiently than ever before. But the war also demonstrated human capacity for resistance, cooperation, and recovery under conditions that would have been considered impossible before 1939. Soldiers learned to fight in conditions ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical jungles. Civilians learned to survive under bombardment, occupation, and systematic persecution. Nations learned to coordinate military operations across multiple continents while maintaining alliance relationships despite fundamental political disagreements. The war created new forms of international cooperation through shared recognition that such conflicts must never be repeated. The United Nations, NATO, and the European Union all emerged from wartime cooperation and post-war recognition that international organization was necessary for preventing future global conflicts. Scientific and technological advances accelerated by wartime needs provided benefits that outlasted the conflict. Antibiotics, blood transfusions, prosthetic devices, computer technology, and jet aviation all emerged from wartime research and development. The war was destructive, but it also accelerated beneficial developments that improved civilian life. Social changes produced by the war, including women's participation in the workforce, racial integration of military forces, and challenges to colonial rule, represented genuine progress toward more egalitarian societies. The war destroyed traditional hierarchies that had prevented social progress, even though it also created new problems that required decades to resolve. The war's demonstration that modern conflicts could threaten human survival led to serious efforts to understand the causes of war and develop methods for preventing nuclear catastrophe. Arms control became a necessity, international law was strengthened, and diplomatic techniques were refined to provide alternatives to military solutions. We remember World War II not just as a military conflict, but as the moment when humanity realized that our technological capabilities had exceeded our wisdom in using them responsibly. The war was a warning about the dangers of ideological extremism, racial hatred, and the application of industrial methods to systematic murder. Today we face similar challenges with nuclear weapons, climate change, cyber warfare, and global economic integration that create possibilities for both unprecedented cooperation and unprecedented destruction, just as industrialization created possibilities for both progress and catastrophic warfare in the early 20th century. The Second World War reminds us that human beings are capable of both remarkable evil and remarkable heroism, that technological progress requires moral progress to be beneficial, and that international cooperation is necessary for survival in a world where local conflicts can have global consequences. But perhaps most importantly, World War II teaches us that even the most comprehensive disasters can be overcome through human determination, international cooperation, and commitment to rebuilding rather than revenge. The war was horrible, but it ended. The peace settlement was imperfect, but it prevented another world war. Human beings learned from their mistakes, even when those mistakes cost tens of millions of lives. The Second World War was not the war to end all wars, but it was the war that taught us why such wars must be prevented through international cooperation, nuclear deterrence, and recognition that modern warfare threatens human civilization itself. That lesson came at a terrible price, but it was learned, and it continues to influence how we think about international relations, conflict prevention, and the proper relationship between technological capability and moral responsibility. In the end, World War II was humanity's most expensive education in the dangers of ideological extremism and the necessity of international cooperation. We're still working on applying that education today, but we're working on it because people who lived through the Second World War refused to accept that such catastrophes were inevitable or acceptable. The Second World War ended not with the elimination of evil or the triumph of good, but with recognition that human beings must find ways to live together peacefully or risk destroying everything they claim to be fighting to preserve. That recognition led to institutions and agreements that have prevented world war for over 70 years, even when regional conflicts and great power tensions threatened to escalate. So here's to the Second World War, humanity's most comprehensive lesson in the dangers of applying industrial efficiency to systematic murder and ideological extremism written in blood and ashes, and the stubborn human refusal to accept that civilization must necessarily destroy itself through military conflict. And you know what? We learned. It took decades of near-catastrophic mistakes during the Cold War, but we eventually learned that nuclear deterrence is preferable to nuclear war, that international cooperation is preferable to ideological confrontation, and that problems are better solved through economic competition than through military conquest. We're still working on that project today. Every time we choose diplomacy over warfare, multilateral cooperation over unilateral action, and peaceful resolution over violent conflict, we're continuing the work that began when people realized that the Second World War must never be repeated. The Second World War was great, not because it was glorious, but because it was so horrible that it forced humanity to find better ways of managing international conflicts. That's not much consolation for the tens of millions who died, but it's something. The war that was supposed to make the world safe for democracy didn't create perfect democracy, but it did eliminate fascism as a viable political option, established international institutions for preventing aggression, and demonstrated that free societies could defeat totalitarian regimes when they cooperated effectively. World War II was humanity's encounter with the reality that modern technology could be used to destroy civilization more efficiently than ever before, but also that international cooperation could prevent such destruction when nations chose cooperation over confrontation. The lesson was expensive, costing tens of millions of lives and destroying centuries of accumulated wealth and knowledge, but it was learned. We stand today on foundations built by people who survived the Second World War and dedicated their lives to ensuring that such catastrophes would never be repeated. Every international organization, every treaty limiting weapons of mass destruction, every effort at peaceful conflict resolution exists because people who lived through 1939 to 1945 understood that the alternative to international cooperation was global annihilation. The Second World War ended with the recognition that in modern warfare, victory requires not just military defeat of enemies, but construction of peaceful international relationships that prevent future conflicts. It was humanity's most expensive education, but it was education nonetheless. Today we face different challenges: terrorism, nuclear proliferation, climate change, and economic inequality that could produce conflicts as destructive as anything the Second World War generated. But we face these challenges with knowledge gained from the Second World War about the importance of international cooperation, the dangers of ideological extremism, and the necessity of solving problems before they escalate to violence. The Second World War taught us that human beings are capable of remarkable destructiveness when they organize their technological capabilities for ideological purposes, but also that they're capable of remarkable creativity when they organize those same capabilities for peaceful purposes. The choice between destruction and construction is still ours to make. So there we have it, another cheerful bedtime story from history's greatest hits collection. Sleep well, knowing that while your ancestors survived all of this somehow, you get to complain about social media arguments and traffic jams instead of air raids and concentration camps. Progress is real, even if it's messier and more fragile than we'd like. The Second World War is over. We made it through, and we're still here, still learning, still trying to make things better. That has to count for something. Sweet dreams, and remember, when you wake up tomorrow in a world where international conflicts are settled through economic sanctions rather than carpet bombing, where war crimes are prosecuted rather than ignored, and where genocide is universally condemned rather than administratively implemented, you're living in the future that Second World War survivors worked to create. It's not perfect, but it's better than trenches, gas chambers, and nuclear warfare. The greatest victory of World War II wasn't the defeat of the Axis powers. It was the construction of an international system that has prevented another world war for over 70 years. That's the real legacy of the most destructive conflict in human history, the recognition that we can do better, and the institutions that help us try.